Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thank you so much for going ahead and joining us here today. For anyone who doesn't know, I am Sam Camarena. I'm the manager of the Advancement Academy, which is the CSU's in-house professional development program for everything advancement. So the Academy and CASE have partnered to offer this very informative webinar on their Alumni Engagement Metrics Survey, a new tool that will better help us quantify all the hard work that we do to engage our alumni and keep them connected to our university. Today's webinar will include presentations by CASE staff and some of our CSU colleagues. I'll have our presenters introduce themselves just before they hop on and provide their presentation, though some of them don't really need the introduction as they're very familiar faces. This webinar is meant to impart a better understanding of the Alumni Engagement Metrics Survey, as well as share how two teams in the CSU prepared their responses to the 2019 survey, which will hopefully inspire your team's approach to coming surveys. So right now I'm just going to go through some quick housekeeping, and then we'll go ahead and dive into our first presentation. And that is all housekeeping. So give me 1 second to stop my share. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first presenter today, Jenny Cook-Smith, joining us from the AEM Atlas team. Jenny, you want to go ahead and hop on, introduce yourself, and start your screen share?
Sure, sounds good. Thanks, Sam. I am really excited to be joining you guys today. Let me just go ahead and pull up my screen. All right, are you seeing that? Perfect. Great. Well, thank you for including CASE in our webinar today. We are really excited to hopefully get you guys excited about the Alumni Engagement Metrics Survey. Before we jump into that, just a brief introduction. I actually recognize some of the folks in the room, so always excited when you know you're in a group with some familiar friends. But for those of you that I don't know, I am our senior strategic consultant at CASE, and as Sam said, I'm actually part of a division that we call AEM Atlas, and that just means the AEM there is advancement metrics, and our Atlas is essentially speaking to the fact that we are global and working on both collecting metrics across the globe, but more importantly, my area of focus is thinking about how do we take this data and make it more valuable for members. I also joke that my side hustle is the Alumni Engagement Metrics Survey. So I've really been spending a lot of time managing that survey this year and working with a lot of volunteers as we plan for next year. So one of my favorite topics to come and talk to folks about. I was at Blackbaud for about 15 years. So for those of you that participated in the Cal State University benchmarking group through DonorCentrics, that was my main role. So no stranger to the idea of analytics and benchmarking, just now looking at these metrics from a little bit wider perspective. As Sam said, the way we've structured this is I'm going to start talking about the survey and talk about some sort of big picture components. And then my fellow speakers are going to talk in much more specifics. So we definitely will welcome your questions, but I'm also going to guess that some of your questions will probably be answered as we go through our session today as well. But at any point, please do feel to use that raise hand, and Sam will nudge me to take a pause. All right. So first things first, I am going to make you work today. So we'd love to just take a moment, and if you could go on your, you can do it on your smartphone or just on another tab, but if you could just take a brief moment and go to the site menti.com. And then when you get there, it's going to prompt you to enter the code 560055. And would just like to get your thoughts when we say the words alumni engagement metrics or measuring alumni engagement, what comes to mind? And I just want to make sure, Sam, do I need to reshare my screen, or can you now see the poll there?
We can see your browser window.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Yeah, so if you guys could just take a moment, those should start popping in momentarily. I will add that you can also be honest. It doesn't have to be nice, flowing, positive thoughts. So any thoughts that come to mind when we talk about measuring alumni engagement. So I can see right off the bat, agree. So I can see some things, participation, community, volunteering, connections, some really nice, warm, fuzzy words, as well as I love that someone just wrote no. I actually picture a grumpy cat saying that. I see battle. I see nebulous. I think nebulous is a very fair term. We're going to talk about some of that. Overwhelming, doing the groundwork, frightening. Yep. Yep, agree. ROI, I do think is incredibly important because I think this has been a challenge for this profession and being able to show all the areas and how why it matters. So glad to see that. I can see communication, numbers, donor data. So a lot of great things coming in. Thank you guys for taking a moment and sharing your thoughts with us. Again, I think you're pretty much in line with what we were expecting as we went into today's session. And for those of you that I'm not sure we'll convert the person that just said no. Hopefully we'll get there. But I think for those of you that expressed some concern, that's exactly why we wanted to take some time and walk through this today. One of the things that I find is helpful is sometimes thinking about what can we learn by doing this. And so I've just thrown together a series of questions that are sort of the first thing that come to mind for me when I start thinking about the data that we're capturing and what we can get out of it. I think this is by no means everything, but the types of things that I get excited about. And again, from someone that spent many years just looking at giving data that we get to add by looking at engagement. And, I think there's range from this idea of, hey, could I just engage more mid-level donors to help grow my pipeline, to what's good. So thinking about my volunteers, what percentage don't give, how does that compare to other institutions? Simply, are there things I could do to better collect the information across the modes, which we'll be talking about today? I also wanted to note before we got any further, and I think this speaks to the idea of the person that wrote nebulous. I agree. And that's actually something I'd like us to take a moment and sort of put out there. And that is, for philanthropy, we're really doing one thing, we're counting. And I actually just used to joke that we don't do accounting, but we're really good at counting. And I would still say we're good at counting. When we move beyond philanthropy, then we move into a territory that I'd like you to start thinking about as measurement. And specifically, by defining measurement here, as you can see, what we're saying is, let's set a bar here. We're trying to reduce the uncertainty about what we're trying to actually find out. And I think if we set those other pieces of engagement that we know we're never capture everything, if we can think about it in that way, to me, that starts to make this a bit more concrete. I will also add a teaser, and we will do this at the very end of our presentation today, that a lot of the enhancements that we've done for year 2 in the presentation are thinking about this idea of how do we continue to reduce uncertainty. And so that's a little teaser for you as we move to think about year 2. So, what I'd like to do, because I know some of you maybe looked at last year's survey and ran away. Some of you took part. We'll hear from those schools in our session in a bit. And then others maybe just aren't that familiar with the survey at all. So I thought I would just walk through and talk briefly about this. One is CASE has actually had this goal for many years. This was something that as we interacted with members in all parts of advancement, that we would continue to hear as a real pain point, that there was no universal system of measuring engagement. And so in order to address that, a few years ago, the Alumni Relations Commission essentially assigned a task force that was focused on putting a flag in the ground and coming up with some metrics once and for all. And so they started with a white paper. Um, Danny's actually going to talk about kind of taking that white paper and using the to help collect some of the data. So I'll hold off on some of the details there, but the idea being that it built a framework that essentially we ended up then using to become that alumni engagement metric survey. The idea being that this is a survey, much like the VSC. I know that all Cal State schools participate in the VSC currently. We want to do this every year so that it's just a process that you close out of your fiscal data and then you'd provide us the alumni engagement results, much like the VSC results. The idea being that if we can get some of these measurements that, while it's not perfect, but that we know is looking at engagement in a similar framework, then we can start to use this to, to help you or to help leaders at the institution set goals, build capacity. And I think right now in these times becomes incredibly important to think about, engagement, knowing that it's going to be a tricky year from a philanthropic perspective. What are opportunities where we really can interact with a wider group of our alumni? So what I'm going to do is I am going to share with you some of the survey results from our first year. I am also going to share those within the framework that I mentioned from the white paper, but I'll note that my colleagues are going to get into a little bit of detail of actually inputting that information itself. Before I hand things over to them, we'll also spend some time talking about some of the survey work we've done around virtual events as well, because we know that folks have had a lot of success as they've done more of this in their institutions. I felt like it'd be a good opportunity to share with you some of the anecdotal feedback we've gotten. So starting though with the alumni engagement metrics survey. So again, this was from year one. And this is CASE's first global survey. And we ended up with participants from about 19 countries that took part. And we had 360 people that submitted some data. We ended up with about 310 submissions that were actually usable. One of the decisions we made early on for the first year was that we weren't quite sure what we needed to make required until we did the survey itself. And so we opened this up with no required fields, and that meant that some people just went in and said, here's the name of our institution, and we got nothing else. So obviously we had to sort of kick them out. And so the data points I'll be sharing with you will be those schools in question. As you can see, most of the institutions were within the states. And when I show you the responses today, most of everything we'll do will be by institution type. All right, so I'm going to start with the basic kind of alumni inputs that we ask for. So this is helping to get an understanding of the size of your program and also the size of your alumni base. And so one of the ways that we do this is we actually ask for counts against 7 different categories. Um, this is an area that I know Danny's going to go to in more detail. So I'll just note a couple of things about this. One is that if you do go to the white paper, you'll see that the task force essentially cast a very wide view of alumni. Specifically that we looked at alumni as any graduate or non-graduate or lifelong learner of the institution. And so in doing so, it also lent the ability to think about some categories within that. That being said, you can see those categories noted here. I will also add that moving into year 2, we will be doing 2 versions of this survey, much like the VSC. We'll have a minimal and a full version. And the biggest differentiation between those is that the minimal will actually just ask for your grads in your non-grads. So if you look at this and automatically you think this is a lot of information, do know that that will be an option. Still the desire being everyone gets to that full version, but we definitely know that not everyone has that level of detail, and particularly across the modes of engagement that we'll be examining. We'll also see that we ask for a category that we call legally contactable. And I'll just note that that is worded intentionally because, again, we do have institutions that are all over the world. And with some places that people just don't have the ability to contact alumni after a specific time, or alumni may have to opt in, we felt like that gave a more level playing field. And for here in the States in general, what I'd say is it just means that you've got phone, mail, or email, and that they haven't opted out of receiving communications from you. One of the measures that I think is really helpful in understanding some of the results, and particularly and as we get more in depth with the numbers, is the ratio of alumni to alumni relations staff. Alumni relations staff FTE was a question we asked, and this is specifically, it could be anyone whose full-time job or part of their job is devoted to alumni relations. And so this isn't a surprise, but I think when you start to look at some of the results, to me, it makes a lot of sense, is that, based on the measures, you can start to see different types of institutions. The alumni are, or the staff are really responsible for contacting a very large group of alumni and engaging with them. One note of clarification for these slides is that when it says graduate, that actually it means institutions that have both undergraduate and graduate programs. So everybody in this room would actually fit into that graduate category, but I left those others in there as a comparison. We also did ask some questions around expenditures and cost. And here I'm showing you this as a breakdown by each country. One thing that you'll see in the asterisk at the bottom is that we asked institutions to report specifically on things that their alumni relations department was writing the check for. So if you look at the smallest of those bars, that orange bar of tech cost, it doesn't mean that there's not expenditures that advancement is spending on alumni relations for technology costs. It just means that a small percentage of those are actually coming out of the alumni relations budget. And I'll note that we'll actually ask a couple of questions this year, a little bit more on technology and staffing, to learn a little bit more about what tech is being used, whether your alumni relations is paying for it or not. And I feel like, because we're going to switch to the modes of engagement next, this is a good point just to pause and see if any questions have emerged so far.
There are no raised hands and no questions yet in the chat.
All right. Well, I will keep us moving then. So the next category that we're going to talk about is what is basically section 2 of the survey, where we're going to move beyond some larger questions about your institution and your structure to the actual ways that alumni can be engaged. And so I thought I'd actually share the definition that was established in the white paper. I really like this definition because I think that it speaks to the idea of the virtuous circle. So specifically, the virtuous circle between alumni and alma mater. And I think, as I've talked to folks and programs all over in the spring, I have really seen that in action, which is thinking about, what can we as the institution do to help benefit our alumni, which of course in turn inspires loyalty and can benefit the institution. And I know anytime I spend any time with the alumni relations folks, I feel like it doesn't take that long for this idea to express itself. So I think what's very important in understanding that framework of how alumni can be engaged.
Jenny, sorry to interrupt, but we got one question in regarding expenditures. Would this be still appropriate to touch on?
Yes.
Sure. So it's a clarifying question. Folks are wondering, are the expenditures based on university funds or alumni association funds?
Great question. So we are specifically looking at fund expenditures that would come out of alumni relations. So it may be a clarification that someone that's at CSU could answer, and perhaps the ones that filled out the survey. But I would say at your institution, if you've got alumni relations specific funds that are part of the university and not part of the alumni association, they should be included. But if everything's coming out of the alumni association, then it would be there. Sorry for the nebulous answer. It's just a little tricky depending on the structure.
So essentially, if it's kind of designated towards the program of alumni relations, it's worth counting.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So they could be both, but just as long as it's related to the program.
Great question. Thanks, Rich. So let me back up a moment. So I'm going to introduce to you the 4 categories of engagement, and we have put these on here in probably the order of most concrete to nebulous, to go back to that word again. I'll just start though at the far left, which are the things we've reviewed, but again, we start with those inputs. And then once we know who we're talking about, then essentially we're going to look at the framework across the 4 modes. So these are the ways that our alumni can engage. With philanthropic, we are talking about both hard and soft credit gifts. So that may be slightly higher than perhaps you'd be reporting in other surveys, such as the VSE. And of course, for all of these categories, because this is a yearly survey, the question becomes, did they do this in the most recent fiscal year? So in the case of philanthropic, was there a hard or a soft credit gift within this most recent fiscal year? Volunteer, I think this is actually pretty defined. I think the bigger struggle with volunteer is actually capturing that information, and we'll see that when we look at some of the results momentarily. And as you can see here, these are really formally defined volunteer roles, and we actually in our white paper list out a whole number of those. Experiential, this is where primarily events would be, of course. It's also where you'd log your season ticket holders. And then if you do have a dues-based alumni association, you would actually count your members here. And thereby, when we start looking at people that are engaged in multiple ways, if someone was both a member and a donor, they would appear in both of those buckets. The last piece is communication. So this is definitely the murkiest of the 4. This is definitely the one that's kept me up at night as we start to understand, what can and we can't count. I do think this is one where both I and certainly our volunteers have really leaned on this definition that's noted here, and again comes from our white paper, which is this idea of of interactive. So communication is not just, hey, we sent them an email, or they're on a list of people that get the newsletter. It really is meant to be people that do something. And so it would include the social stuff. So if you've got people that are posting, they are commenting, liking, etc., that's where that goes. With a major caveat that we know that most institutions do not currently collect that at a level that goes back to an individual. So that, again, it fits the definition, but we also know the struggle is it's just not something that a lot of places are coding. It would also include some more basic things like letters to the editor, event evaluations, people that submitted changes of data updates. So some of the other interactions that can happen. I will add, and again, we'll get into this more at the end of our session, but in year 2, this will also include click-through rates. We were a little, year 1, we said, let's at least just get this out. But after a year and after talking to a number of people, and again, working with the volunteers, felt like that click-through rates are something that when something happens, if somebody clicks through, there's an action taken and by the institution. And so we felt like, again, it's less active than these other means, but still a form of someone raising their hand and expressing interest. So what I'd like to do is just share with you some of the results that we had from year 1, with the idea that, I am always, anytime I talk to anybody about this survey, I always say year 1 was really establishing counting practices. So we are not at a place where we want to say we want to do a full survey report out. We kind of feel like, hey, we figured this thing out. We know what else we need. And that's really a goal as we move into this second year. But as you can see here, what we'll start with is this idea of the percent engaged philanthropically. So with all of these percentages, we're basically saying the number of alumni engaged in this mode divided by legally contactable. These are the same categories that we saw earlier, and they're basically in order of the bars, where I showed you at the beginning that, hey, look at the number of staff that are reaching out to all this alumni. You can see, I think graduate was the second highest and second highest as we look here. And again, where most of you would fit, or all of you, I think. This, again, probably slightly higher than if you compared this with your hard credit numbers. The next area we looked at was the percent engaged experientially. So again, in this case, the graduate institutions slightly overtook the professional institutions for the next slot there, as far as it's slightly more engaged. That makes sense when you think about the amount of events and, again, some of those athletic opportunities within graduate institutions that the professional probably don't have. Also, when you get to your undergraduate and independent schools, that's where we're going to have a lot more reunion type experiences. And again, a lot smaller pool of alumni that we'd probably be working with there. The next category is volunteers. So as I've been working with institutions, I've actually been working with a group of land grant institutions that are participating in our new facilitated cohorts. And we came to them with their results, so specific to the schools in the cohort. And I think the number one reaction across the board was, all right, we all have work to do. But then I think if you start going below the surface, then we start to understand, is it work to do in engaging more, or is it work to do in capturing more information, or is it some of both? Again, as we looked at some changes for next year, that's some transparency we're adding into the survey. But I will add that I think that really jumps out when we start to look at volunteer numbers. I think there is a challenge that there's probably, especially when we look at large institutions, people that are volunteering that we just may never know exactly who those folks are. But as you can see, I think those numbers, at least to me, were slightly lower than I probably would have expected before going into this process. I will add, though, there are absolute outliers in there. I'll pick on our friends at Dartmouth, for example. I think they have something like 80% volunteer or something crazy to that number. So it really does also differ depending on the type of schools. And again, that reunion piece is a big piece of that. And then we move into communication. And again, this one had a lot of answers across the board, given the level that people were able to provide. I will also note that about 60% of the institutions could provide this mode. So the flip side being 40% just did not track anything in this measure. And as we move into the minimal survey for next year, we are expecting that again. And so that will be out of the 4 modes, the one mode that we're not actually making required, because we know that some institutions just do not track that yet. And we'll work on analysis that really depends on whether you tracked communication or didn't as we start to do some of those comparisons. So, just some more fun before we turn it over to the actual specific testimonials of how institutions made this happen. One of the things that I learned over the years and looking at annual giving metrics is that the last thing we want to do is just boil it down to one measure. And so, as you start thinking about these data points, uh, it's not to me just the percentage of alumni that are engaged. There's a lot of other ways we can look at these. And one of them that I've really been thinking a lot about this summer and I'm quite excited about is this idea of engagement health. So by that, I simply mean let's sum up these 4 modes. Now we know that there's going to be people that appear in more than one category, but that's okay. And the reason is if this number is getting larger, then you've got one of two or two of things happening. That is that you're either engaging more alumni and or you are engaging alumni in more ways. And I think both point to a sign of increasing health. And so that's a measure we're really excited about longitudinally being able to see over time. And again, sort of see as a comparison from institution to institution. We also can gain a lot of understanding and you're deeply engaged alumni. So we are working out a lot of analysis of both onlys and ands and all 4 so that we can really start to see, what does that look like? And again, help you as you start to think about setting some benchmarks in your own program. And then lastly, I'll add that we do not collect this now. We won't be collecting it in year 2, but we are starting a pilot project where we're going to begin to collect some core metrics for all practice areas. And one of those specific to alumni relations is starting to think about this from a trend perspective. So, how many newly engaged alumni and how many of those that are engaged, in 2+ years or thinking about our loyal engagement. And when I share with you the results of our surveys, we've actually seen some good progress in both of these groups. So I did want to just take a couple minutes on some output that you'll get. So for year 1, the institutions that took part, and we'll be doing the same for year 2, get what we call a GPS report. So this just stands for Graphical Program Summary, or if you're a fan of Office Space, you can think TPS. But regardless, the idea here being that one of the things we heard from members is a desire for CASE to help say, here are the people that you look like based on data. We did that for the VSC. We actually pulled out 10 peers that you look most like. And then we also did this for the alumni engagement. For alumni engagement, because it's a much smaller group with the 300, we said here are the 5 peers that look closest to you, and that's based on the variables and the weights that you can see here on the screen. And then basically we bump everybody up against you and we say these 5 look most like you, and then you get these visuals for the areas that I had mentioned earlier. And I have just one kind of view I'll share with you. And that you can see is, those 7 modes that I mentioned earlier. This is, of course, just sample data. But what we can see is our institution was an undergraduate. They gave us data for just undergraduate and non-degreed. And so we can see, if we look particularly at their undergraduate population, that they actually have a much higher percentage of volunteers than their peers, than the US median, and for AEM overall. So just a quick example of the way we'd start to visualize that information. So lastly, really quickly, I thought it'd be fun just to share some other anecdotal results with you. So we did a survey it was global. We had about 430 folks respond from 30 different countries. And we really wanted to think about this as innovations and alumni engagement with programs going virtual and adapting in response to COVID. And so what you can see is that 2/3 basically said that they felt like their alumni had been highly responsive to engagement efforts. I was actually just presenting some of this information at a session right before this, and had asked folks at that time to feel free to jump in and say if they've got some extra information that either mirrors this or is different than what we're seeing. Feel free to jump in with any successes or struggles you've had. As you can see here, though, about 70% really felt like, yeah, we've got a captured audience, but we still have not really struggled to engage alumni. We did also look at success in previously unengaged alumni. So that idea of newly engaged, and thinking about, are you being able to use some of these new initiatives to bring people in that perhaps never would have been involved before? And even more of those, almost 70%, said, well, we've also been able to deepen the relationships with our already engaged alumni. And again, anecdotally, I've heard examples from volunteer leadership, from virtual board meetings, from awards to Facebook Live sessions, all kinds of creative things that people are doing that are getting some of these responses. And in terms of virtual events, that was probably the most overwhelming area where people, felt like, A, we're doing these, and secondarily, this is here to stay. This was kind of the thing we knew we needed to do all along. It's forced us to think about some virtual events, and I added a few responses there. And again, when we come back at the end, I'll talk a little bit about how we'll be addressing that in year 2. Before I pass things over, I did see Justin's comment. I wholeheartedly agree with you, which you said it's a great place, or it'd be great to get a place where we think about overall engagement the same way we do giving, live bunts, side bunts, etc. And that is absolutely when we think of that pilot where we're starting to look at trends and newly engaged, our loyal engaged, and then, as you said, when we think of side bunts, who disengaged that we were able to get back again. So definitely that direction we're going. And I would also add, if anybody on the call gets super jazzed when they hear that and you're interested in helping us out with that pilot project, we'd be happy to chat. So if there's no other questions right now, I will pass things over to Danny and Delia.
Thank you, Jenny. Welcome, everyone. Let me just take a moment to share my screen. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces. My name is Danny Reeder. I am the Senior Director of Advancement Services at Cal State Northridge. I'm joined today by my colleague Delia Escobar, and we're here today to present our approach to the engagement survey. For those of you who are not familiar with it, we're hoping that we can make things a little easier, a little less painful for when you do start compiling and putting together the data. For those of you who are familiar with it, please feel free to share your thoughts. We'd love to hear your perspective. So our first step in reporting on this data was to read the guidance documentation. It's 16 pages and it provides definitions and explanations on the various data points and categories. I'm not going to go through all 16 pages, but I did want to point out a few parts of the documentation, a few excerpts, if you will, that helped us understand where CASE is coming from here as far as their approach and strategy to the survey. Over the years, we've compiled data for many different types of surveys and reports, and sometimes it can feel like you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, or that you're comparing apples to oranges. Of course, we do our best to provide the data that's being provided, that's being requested, but sometimes without a clear understanding of a survey's intent or objective, that can be a challenge and an exercise in frustration. So we appreciate how CASE lays things out here. They send a clear signal that they understand the inherent challenges in collecting this kind of data. After all, each campus is its own island in certain respects. We have different priorities, different staffing, So we're not all going to collect this type of data in exactly the same way. Therefore, the survey is not going to be perfect, at least at the onset, but nevertheless, I think CASE has done a good job finding the common thread, and their approach of starting simple and basic with the intent of evolving the survey over time. I think it's a great strategy and one that I often employ when implementing new systems or initiatives here at CSUN. So our next step in the process was to meet with our colleagues in alumni relations and devise a plan for collecting the data. And beyond the actual categories and data points, which we'll get into, I first want to touch on what I call our goals and gains, which is something I do before starting any project. What is our strategy? What are we looking to accomplish? How will this benefit us, especially as it relates to the amount of time that's involved? So our first goal is to leverage existing codes. We have hundreds of different codes in Razor's Edge, our CRM, and typically those are attributes in Razor's Edge for those of you who are familiar. And behind each of those codes and attributes, there's a considerable amount of work and implementation time that goes into setting those up. There's rules and logic and processes, and codes are connected to other codes and other procedures. And all of those elements have to be discussed and thought through. And there's a staff member who's typically assigned to that code to make sure it's refreshed and updated and connected properly to any number of different parts of the database and queries and exports and custom reports. So when we begin a project like this, we try to, take advantage of all that work we put into those existing processes and utilize those codes without having to create new codes and new procedures. And that certainly was the case here. We were able to leverage our existing procedures and codes. Our next goal was to create consistent procedure and how-to documentation guides. That's really crucial for us whenever we're approaching a project like this. We always want to take the time on the front end to document what we've decided, what our policies and procedures are with relation to the project, so that a year from now, when we've forgotten most of the details, we have this documentation that helps us, saves us time, and it maintains consistency. So when we're talking about gains, collaboration, me and my staff in advancement services, we can talk all day, every day about data and codes and technical processes. But we do understand that our colleagues in other divisions have a limited amount of time and bandwidth in which to engage us in those conversations. So when we have a project like this that we can partner on, where there are specific outcomes and benefits, that's a great opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for us to promote what we do in advancement services. It's an opportunity to increase everyone's understanding of the database and hopefully make the database less daunting and more user-friendly. And it builds synergy. We have a great partnership and relationship with our colleagues in alumni relations who we work closely with on this project. And this project was another opportunity for us to engage. And I think it makes our relationship even stronger through projects such as this. Another gain, clean data. Like I said, we have a lot of codes, and we try as best we can to keep those codes fresh in our minds, but that's not always possible. So this is an opportunity for us to circle back to some codes, rethink them or refresh them, what have you. Another gain, I think we can all agree that's the main reason why this report exists now, for us to have useful metrics, valuable information that we can use that'll help guide our conversations, guide our strategy, what's working, what isn't. We're excited to have this along with information, valuable information that we get from the VSE regarding giving information. This engagement information will be very useful to us. And in fact, our colleague Samantha in Alumni Relations, she's already started diving into the data, creating some spreadsheets. So we're excited to participate in this going ahead. So let's take a look at the two main sections of the survey, the alumni counts and input section. I'll just walk through briefly each of these categories. Associate diploma degree, we don't have that. We don't provide those degrees, so we don't have that information. Undergraduate, postgraduate, multiple degree. Those of you who are familiar with the VSE report, this information is collected a little differently than the VSE. In the VSE, if you're an undergrad and a grad, you're counted in the undergrad section. In the engagement survey, there's separate categories for undergrad only, postgrad only, multiple degree. And then our certificate or awards, that's our credential alumni. That's data we started collecting a couple of years ago. So we're able to provide that information. Our non-graduates are our non-degreed alumni who've earned 20 units or more. And our others are our honorary degree alumni. And looking at the three columns here, living alumni count, I'm sure everyone tracks your deceased alumni. We have some systems in place where that information comes to us from various channels. So we're able to stay up to date on that information. Opted out, we have several different opt-out categories based on the communication channel. The one we use here is our all-encompassing opt-out category of no communication. Legally contactable, if someone has a good email, a good phone, or a good address, they would be counted in this column. I'll pause for a second if anyone has any questions on this section.
No raise hands and nothing in the chat, Danny.
Okay. So let's move on to the second main section of the survey. I will be honest with you, when I first saw this, I was frightened and I wanted to run away. But when you really look at it and you get into the different categories here, it's really just these four sections that you have to define, and these other columns are combinations of those four sections. I'll turn it over to Delia in a few minutes, and she's going to go over how we gather the data for these different columns. But let's just take a look at the four main sections. Jenny went over some of this, but very briefly, the philanthropic section includes hard and soft credit, pledge payments, planned gifts. It excludes pledges, matching gifts. A side note, donor advised fund donors has been a challenge for us, counting those donors in other reports. But in this case, since we are including soft credit, we're able to easily include those donors here. The volunteer section, we were able to hit most of the bullet points in this section, including advisory board, volunteer board, ambassadors, mentors, classroom speakers, alumni profile interviews. We have processes in place where that information is entered into our database in an efficient manner. And most of this information is tracked in our relationship tab. One of the challenges that Jenny mentioned for us that we don't provide is that social media component. Of course, that's something that we have looked into. Those are great metrics that we would like to include, but we're just not prepared, like many of you at this point, to include that information. Experiential, that includes event participation, season ticket holders, meaningful contacts from our development officers, and the dues paying membership. A challenge for us looking forward, we are currently in the process of restructuring our membership program. So looking ahead, those numbers are going to look different for us in subsequent fiscal years. Communication, CASE identifies this as probably the most difficult section to report on because of that social media component, which again, we don't track. But we are able to track class notes submitted by alumni, constituents who update their contact information, either through contacting the Alumni Relations Office directly or via our student calling system, Campus Call. Most of the other data points are a challenge in this area. We don't have a system or procedure for collecting survey responses, event evaluation forms, letters to the editor, and social media data. I will note that there is some information that we probably could have provided, but we chose not to because we just didn't feel like it was strong enough. For example, meaningful contacts, other meaningful contacts from our development officers. Of course, they enter their contact reports into the database, which reflect their phone and email conversations, but we don't really have a way to determine which one of those are meaningful. We would first have to define meaningful, then we'd have to create a code to mark those contacts, and then we'd have to train the development officers to use that code. So that's just one example of something that we might consider including down the road, but we would of course have to have those conversations and set up that new code. Before I turn it over to Delia and let her show you how we set this up, I'll pause again for any questions or comments. All right. So I'll just a quick note, before we start on a project like this, we consider what the best platform or software to use to set up something like this. You know, we have Tableau, we have Crystal Reports, we have Access, we have the database itself. And as Delia will show you, we chose to set this up in Razor's Edge using queries, and Delia will explain that and give you those details. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Delia.
Hi everyone, I'm Delia Escobar and I've been working at CSUN for just about 4 years. And I've been working with Razor's Edge for a little over 17 years now. So I'm going to be going over basically our method to this survey madness, which is not that bad. It's actually, and once you break it up, it's not as cumbersome as it appears. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so a couple of things that we considered when we were tackling this project is, first thing we did was look at the criteria. Based on the definitions, kind of decide what things we're currently doing and how we're coding them in Razor's Edge. And so once we decided what items we were going to select for each category, each mode of engagement, we went ahead and looked at our current coding. So, you know, like Danny said, we don't like adding additional coding. It's just additional work, and then trying to set up those processes to make sure that those codes are kept clean and useful in perpetuity. So looking at our current coding, like for example, our telemarketing campaign, we have a year-round calling campaign, and not all calls are what we would consider meaningful. So one of the things that we looked at were like how you know, in this day and age, people are somewhat mistrusting of giving up their contact information, like emails, addresses in particular. So we looked at, okay, well, we're importing those address updates and we track how we get that information. So if there's coming from a telemarketing call, we do use InfoSource on the address to code that it either came from a telemarketing call or from alumni relations department. So that way we exclude any data appends that we might do. So that's somewhat how we leverage the current coding, and we just kind of mix things together. So it wasn't like a straightforward code, this is what we're doing. We just looked at everything that we're currently doing in Razor's Edge and developed queries around that. The other thing we considered was time frame. We looked at the timing, and you know, we didn't really have the time to set this survey as a major crystal report per se, you know, like making sure that all the logic was there and then we're not double counting people in, or that event or that engagement in multiple sections. We just want to make sure that engagement will counted once in each category. So once we decided that was not where we were going to go, we said, okay, we're just going to do the queries and merge queries and Rachel's Edge. And it worked out pretty fast for us. It was something that we could just refresh and run whenever we need it. So that's basically how we ended up deciding on doing queries. So next up, once we decided about doing about the queries, we needed to figure out, okay, how are we going to go about creating these queries and making sure we're doing this in a appropriate order and, you know, not double counting people in different categories. So first thing was to set up a major grid. It actually looks very similar to the engagement survey table. And we just plotted our way through. Once we started with the first section of counting alumni counts, we just went on and did the section with all the engagement codes. Next up was creating the alumni queries, creating the engagement mode queries, and we just ran it and created merge queries to combine those combinations where there's, you know, we're evaluating multiple codes at the same time. Okay. So this is our map. You can see it looks very similar. It's just, you know, our Excel sheet. We did kind of, because refreshing queries in Rachel's Edge when they're static, it takes a little extra step to make sure that they update correctly. But you can see that we entered the name of the query in our table here. And actually, I went ahead and did this before counting how many queries or labeling a number, which number query it was to run. So I did not know how many I created from the onset. It did end up being about over 100 queries, probably about 130, I would say. But it goes really fast. So first thing we had to tackle was obviously the different types of alumni counts. So we had that section up here. And then, of course, the first part was the main 4 categories of alumni engagement. So once we had these set, the rest was just smooth sailing through the rest of the survey. Okay. So here's our case alumni queries. You can see that there's quite a few. We ended up numbering them, so next year we know which order to go into. Because some of these are contingent on having a query ran or merged before running the next one. And of course, our 4 engagement mode queries. Now, these are basically the crux of that whole table, was creating these 4 main queries for experiential, volunteer, philanthropic, and communication. And which kind of doing this sets us up for success going forward, meaning if there are any changes to criteria, we only need to change these 4 queries or any one of these 4 queries. Everything else will line itself up. Once we run the merges, it just updates all the rest of the count. So this is basically our bread and butter of the main survey. So here we go. Of course, once we created each query for each mode, we went ahead and merged them with each of the alumni count main queries that we get. And of course, the rest, all the combination categories with philanthropic and volunteer and so forth, we were just, let's merge them together. And then once it got to, you know, the 4, it got a little hairy there. So there are a couple more merges that we need to do on that side. But again, once we're done with like those 4 queries, everything else was just really easy to just run and plop in the number in the survey. And that's basically what we did. The next slide, I will say, looks crazy, but it's not too crazy once you get in there and we're just going down the list. But here's a list of all the queries that we do. And some of you have been wondering, oh God, why? But we did this for a reason. 1, that's easy to update. 2, it's forward looking. We don't want something that we have to change coding in a report, change the formulas or the something that we're counting. It's just 4 queries that we just have to worry about. And that is one of the reasons why we went this route. And the other thing was, it really went really quick. It was fast turnaround. We didn't, once we had the criteria set, and we built the queries, these ran really fast. So it was the fastest, most successful way that we were able to do the survey. And that's basically it.
Awesome. I was gonna thank you guys very much for sharing that. And lots of detail, lots of specifics, and of course we're sharing that with everybody right now, and we're saving the recording of this webinar so that folks can reference that later in the fall, so they can use that in current year's survey, or to reference later on to see if they can pull whatever they need from CSUN's process. So very nice. And then up next we have the team from Cal State San Bernardino that's going to share more of an alumni relations focused approach to the way that they completed the survey last year. So without further ado, Crystal, are you ready?
Yes, thank you so much for having us on. I'm Crystal Weimer-Lucero. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations at Cal State San Bernardino, and I'm joined by my colleague, Jenna Archuleta, who helps handle our data internally within the Alumni Office. So to give everyone an idea of what we were looking at, our approach was very, very different than Danny's. We don't have an Advancement Services Director. Currently, that position is vacant. With the budget, we'll see what happens. But in addition, in looking at our database, we have somebody from IT who's assigned about half time to help us with that. So we just don't have the manpower to do the larger queries that, of course, we would like to set up. In addition, our database tracks all donors and potential donors, parents, alumni, friends, corporations, students. So we really had to cull through a lot of information to kind of pull out what we needed. There's historical data, which is fantastic, but leads to a lot of inconsistencies as different iterations of offices have come or people have been involved, things kind of gone in and out of vogue, or codes that were used are no longer used, or vice versa. People were coding things differently and utilized across campus. So we had to be careful to make sure that we weren't making adjustments or adaptations to something that somebody else was actually using.
So like Crystal said, once we realized that we needed to have some assistance, the subject matter experts come in and help us out since they do manage that database, we knew that we needed to partner with Advancement Services, who does manage the constituent database, and institutional research, as Crystal said, who's able to help us really download and analyze all of that data.
So for our strategy, we knew in order to accomplish this, not only did we really need to get our partners on board, but we needed to really go through what AEM was looking for. So as Danny shared, we read the definitions, so we knew what the guidelines were. We sat down and met with our partners to define what the roles would be, looked at deadlines. This was due right around Christmas, if I remember correctly, which means people are out of the office. So we had to balance making sure that not only was the data that we were reviewing and submitting for the last fiscal year fully input, but that also we did it in a timely enough manner that people could get done what they needed to get done before various breaks. And after that, go. So to define or share what track we took or strategy that we had with our partner, we assigned an action plan depending on every partner's level of expertise. So as we mentioned before, both Advancement Services and institutional research were just so necessary partners for this because we are not data people, right? We're the events people, we're the volunteer people. So we don't have the expertise on our team to really delve into some of this information. So we relied on the partners that did. We looked at AEM first as alumni relations team and defined the criteria. We asked Advancement Services for a list of codes. And as I mentioned, because this is a database that everyone on campus uses and has a lot of historical information, codes were everywhere. We use Elysian's Advanced. So some activities were stored in contact reports. Some were stored under activities. Some were stored under volunteers. Some were stored under board rules. just kind of all over the place. So Advancement Services ran a list of all active codes within the database, with, of course, primarily targeting the last fiscal year, but giving us a chance to look more holistically. And we had highlighted and identified exactly which ones we needed and what they were and the codes we were looking for. Provided that to Advancement, who ran it against the database of everyone engaged. Then both Alumni and Advancement provided that all the institutional research, who then did the cross-comparing and provided our report outputs.
So as Crystal mentioned, our first step really was reviewing those codes, and then after really defining our events and programs based on those AEM definitions, based on those 4 modules of engagement. So we wanted to give you guys a little example of how we went through that process, because we understand it is sort of subjective to campuses and different programs and different goals that you have for your events and programs. So if you look at something like commencement, right, does it fall under volunteer, experiential, or both? So we really had to evaluate what our goals were for our programs. For something like commencement, we tend to get really positive feedback from our alumni who love volunteering their time at that event, who love seeing the new grads, welcoming them into the alumni family. So we ended up classifying that event as volunteer rather than something that's more of a combination. But for example, with our Alumni Day at Dodger Stadium, one of our biggest events of the year, you know, that event is more of an experiential. It's an event that they come out to have that experience with the alumni family. But we did also incorporate this year a donation component to those tickets. So that was an event that we felt really fell under a combination category, right? Philanthropic and experiential. So we just wanted to give you guys an example of how we went through those definitions and how we really started to classify, as that was one of our biggest parts of the project. One of our main roles was to look at those codes and to look at the definitions and really match them up appropriately.
This was a heavy source of debate within our team and one of the more difficult pieces, but not in a bad way. That goes to show that the rest of the survey really wasn't all that bad once we had everything set up. But we really had to look at motivation and goals. So by deciding that Dodgers was a combination event, we looked at ticket sales before announcing the donation component or after. What was driving people to do this? Were they equally driven by given the opportunity to attend an event while also contributing to the future? Or were they more driven by attending the event or more driven by the philanthropic component? So once we were able to have these really philosophical discussions and look at our data, really allowed us to determine what all of those were. And we anticipate this will change in the future, not only as our events evolve, but as CASE continues to refine what they're looking for. But this gave us a chance to look holistically at our events to see what are we doing and why are our alumni engaged or excited about it.
Okay, so now that we had completed our role, we passed that information on to Advancement Services and Institutional Research. They were able to go ahead and finalize that data in an efficient and easy manner for us to be able to complete the survey. So again, we just want to highlight the importance of our partners, how much we appreciate them, and how integral it is to have that partnership, because they were able to actually provide us spreadsheets with all of the information we asked for. Again, once we defined those codes, once we defined our criteria, they were able to provide it with us, and we were literally able to copy and paste into the survey to get it done quickly and efficiently within our deadlines, of course.
So just to give a brief overview of some of the lessons that we learned while going through this, the major one was, oh my God, how? It looks really daunting. It's a big chart, but it's really not bad, especially when CASE has outlined very specific verbiage on their categories, with giving you just enough wiggle room to interpret it for your own campus. It became very clear and very easy of how to differentiate these. It just really takes sitting down and focusing not only with your team, but also with subject matter experts you're relying on to help you pull that information. In addition, we needed to look at ensuring our data collection methods and changes to activity codes weren't negatively or adversely impacting our campus partners. So as I mentioned, a lot of people on campus use this. So we didn't want to deactivate a code or eliminate a code that somebody was actively using. Or when looking at golf tournaments, okay, well then do we need to have a specific one for every chapter that hosts a golf tournament? Do we look at a more holistic code that encompasses all golf tournaments? So not only working with an advancement, but really looking at what the data overall is presenting us and how we can work better with it in the future as a whole. weren't able to answer a lot of the questions about social media and some of the communications things Case was asking for, simply because we don't track that data. So we'd want to encourage you to not be discouraged that just because you don't have an answer for every category doesn't mean you can't still submit the information that you do have. Now that we understand what Case is looking for, it gives us a chance to start to try to collect that data for this year. But frankly, as Jenny mentioned, some of these are just going to be a little bit more difficult for campuses. We'd also previously been really event focused before. I think that can be common in alumni shops. But now with looking at holistically who's involved in what and seeing these numbers emerge as we compare these categories in a way that we hadn't before allowed us to be more strategic and nuanced with the things that we were doing. It allowed us to look more holistically as how many people are interested in things that are philanthropic and experiential. Perhaps we should start doing more of that. Or, okay, we see that there's not a huge interest in that, but there is a huge interest in volunteer and experiences. Okay, how can we do more of that? So although it was a challenge to compare them, it really gave us good information. And I think lastly is the question we're all trying to answer. How do we move forward with COVID? How do we do this? What does our engagement look like? And we're happy that Jenny's sharing that Case is looking at that next year of this is our new normal. Even as we go back to in-person events, there was probably still going to remain a place for this online engagement. How do we track that and what does it look like?
So after completing the survey, and as Crystal mentioned, realizing some of the challenges that came along with it, although it was challenging at times, it really gave us a fantastic opportunity moving forward because of the questions that it asked us. So now we're able to appropriately clean up our database in advance so that we are prepared for the next time we're filling out the survey. Like Crystal mentioned earlier, we want to make sure to activate codes that are relevant and deactivate codes that are no longer relevant to us, and again, regularly reviewing those instead of waiting for something like the survey. We want to continue to create consistency amongst our advancement colleagues with those codes, always keeping in touch with them and making sure that we're doing something that works for everyone, and definitely increasing our alumni engagement through these different pathways, finding those opportunities to incorporate more of these engagement modes into our programming.
We also see the opportunity for all of you, if you want to do this survey, to know that you don't necessarily need to have a ton of people available at your disposal to be able to get this done. By utilizing some really key partners and key strategic areas that know really well how to work with some of this information, you can still accomplish the survey. So lastly, just for us looking to the future, we have a plan to evaluate the data routinely as an office to make sure we're categorizing appropriately, and also continuing to refer to the definitions as we're setting up events so we make sure that, one, not only we're remaining consistent, but two, that we're able to target the areas that we want to target. This not only helps our team stay on the same page, but also as we assist our chapters in the campus. Just like all of us, oftentimes data collection, although important, doesn't always make it back as timely to the place that we want it to make it back to, because we are done with one event, we're running straight towards the next one. We may have an event the next day. So for us, it's made sure that we've reaffirmed our commitment to not only collecting the data, but then immediately putting it back in the database. Okay, that's it for us. If anyone has any questions for us.
Awesome. Thank you, Crystal and Jenna, very much for sharing. So yeah, like Crystal said, we'll take a couple minutes here just to pause and see if anybody has any questions for either the team at San Bernardino or Northridge regarding their presentations. And feel free to raise your hand or drop something in the chat, and we'll be sure to address it right now. Alrighty, going to pause for just a couple more seconds in case anybody's typing something.
While that's happening, I'll just share my screen so we can get the logistics ready.
Sure. And the last part of today's webinar is just going to be kind of looking forward to what's in the works or what's coming from the survey for its second year. But I'll give one more chance for folks to raise their hand or submit a question. Alrighty, seeing none, Jenny, go ahead.
All right, I'll wrap this up. So by the way, it's always really fun to do this when I get to sit back and hear how people actually took the time and were so reflective and desirous of making sure they got it right. So well done to the teams at CSUN and San Bernardino. It was really incredible to hear the efforts that you guys did, and glad to hear it's paying off. What I wanted to just wrap up with the group is talk a little bit about year two. We've actually spent the past few months engaging with some volunteers all over the world to make sure that as we move forward in this into year two, knowing that this is a survey that will continue to evolve and change, to figure out what do we do next. And so one of the things I mentioned earlier, but I wanted to make sure that this group was aware, is there will be two versions in year two, and that will be a minimal and a full survey. So again, similar to the VSE, there'll be two versions of that. And I'm actually just going to forward a slide really quickly. So the example here is a much, much smaller grid than what Danny showed on the screen. And that is because we really did, after going through, step back and say, well, what are the things that we feel like are the most important pieces that we want somebody to try to get to take part? And so you can see the minimal example. We still have those 4 modes. We are going to make all modes required, all 4 modes in the full survey for the next year, but the minimal survey, communication is not required. And then instead of all of the combo modes as required, you're going to have just, were they in all 4? Or were they in one of the 4? So at least engaged in one of those modes. So I felt really comforted by all the ways that they were talking about getting from to that big grid. But again, some of you may just not necessarily have that info. So hopefully that takes away some level of concern. I also wanted to note the thing I'm actually most excited about with year 2, which is a confidence level measure for volunteer, experiential, and communications. So what we mean by that is, reflecting again on exactly what both institutions talked about with some of their experience, is you're just not capturing everything. And so we wanted a little bit more transparency and insight into this, so that as you start comparing your metrics with peers, you can understand, is it because we're just not capturing it, or is it because it's not happening? And so the idea of this confidence level is we'll ask the question of, how confident are you that the data that you've captured is representative of what's happening at your institution? And again, we'll ask that specific to volunteer, experiential, and communication. And the answer is supposed to be really simple: not very confident, somewhat confident, or confident. So we're hoping that as you think about participating, that having that extra layer makes it a lot easier to not just boil it down to one number and say, oh, we look bad because we don't have the data. You actually have a place to add that additional information there. The other piece I wanted to note is that we are going to add, and this is the second to the last bullet, a section specific to operations and technology. Now, don't worry, it's just 2 questions. I think our volunteers started with a list of 10, and then we boiled it down to the most 2 important things. And that was, simply provide for us the software that your institution is using to capture, event manage, volunteer manage, analyze, visualize, anything to do with your alumni relations. And we did that because more and more members were telling us that, we actually capture this across 6 different pieces of software. And just being able to have that understanding of comparison to other institutions and knowing, can you do it in fewer, would be really helpful. I'd say the side note is it allows CASE to work more closely with educational partners as we try to prioritize, where do we start building this in? The more times we see that software coming up, the quicker we can get in with the right folks. The other question there actually pertains to what Crystal said, which is there's a question specific to database management and staff devoted to that. The one other thing I will note is that last bullet, which is we did 2 things to address virtual programming. One, we reviewed the guidance document to make sure that all of the virtual events and the things that we were hearing that people were doing. So, for example, downloading podcasts, we've added that as a form of communication. We've made sure that virtual events are noted there and the experiential engagement. So that's all been added to the document. But more specifically, we have a new question that says, specific to virtual events, tell us how many people engaged in at least one virtual event, how many engaged in at least one in-person event, and how many engaged in both. Again, helping us in the future be able to start to see that balance as people have an option to do one or the other. The last thing I will note, just in terms of timing, so we were incredibly appreciative of the institutions that took part in year one, because I think the survey actually got out the door in October. And as Crystal said, we were begging for responses by the end of December. This year, we are planning on this rolling out late August. I think we'll actually finish it up within this week. And then we're giving a really long collection time through the end of December. So hopefully from a timing perspective, that will be easier for you. We're also going to be doing a series of webinars to talk specifically about this, and producing some toolkits that have some suggestions for, based on, whether you just are collecting this in Excel or you're using a certain type of system. Here's some suggestions for gathering this information. I mentioned the GPS report earlier. We have launched facilitated cohorts to really get into some of the stories around alumni relations and the other practice areas. So just as an FYI, that's something we are recruiting for now. And I also wanted to note two other things we're recruiting for while I've got you guys, and that's the next to the last bullet. So we do a conference on alumni engagement strategies, and we're really reimagining it this year as we go online. It's going to be in December, and we have decided to do tracks this year. We're actually going to do 5 tracks. 4 are going to be the various modes, so talking really about strategies for each of those 4 modes. And then the 5th track, that's all going to be about the data side of things. I think both from the capture to the visualization to the aha moments. In my experience with CSUs, you guys have really great ideas. I've certainly seen it on the annual giving side. So I'd say if anybody is here, do you think you've got something to add for alumni engagement strategies? We're actually for the first time doing a call for proposal for that. That should be going out soon, but feel free to message me and I can make sure you get the info. And then I mentioned this earlier, but we're also starting in a pilot project as we begin to collect core metrics. And so again, if you got real jazzed about any of this and you'd like to talk about that Libont-Sibont piece for alumni engagement in more detail, that's a great opportunity too. And I know we're at about at time. I'll just note this. This presentation has been loaded in the drive, and all of the contact information, as well as our link to the page that has things like a survey grid that you could use in Excel, and our white paper, and the new white paper will be there. That's all linked here as well.
Super. Thanks again, Jenny, very much for joining us here today and imparting all the great information from the AEM Atlas side. So I'll pause again. We have 2 minutes till we're set to wrap up, but to see if anybody in the group has any questions on any of the above. A big thanks again to all of our campus presenters as well. They received absolutely no compensation for their time today. So they're just doing this out of the sheer kindness of their hearts. So a big virtual round of applause for them. Definitely. All right, so I'll just pause here for just a few more minutes to see if anybody has any final thoughts or questions. And we're happy to hear from you guys. If you think of anything, clap, 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 yes. If you think of anything after the webinar and you're like, gee, that's a good thing I should have asked. If the slides aren't available yet with everyone's contact information, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll of course forward it along to the appropriate presenter. So like I said, I'll just pause here for just a couple more seconds. If you're all done, thank you again for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. And if anybody has any questions, we'll hang out for just a minute or two more. So thanks, everyone.
Sam, a big thanks to you too. I know how much work goes into these sessions. I really enjoy getting together with my colleagues. So thanks to you as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Danny.
Great job, Sam.
From the presenter side of things, I do a lot of these, and this was probably the most well prepared. I've done it a long time, so kudos to you for sure, Sam.
Alrighty, that is 11:30. Thanks again, everybody, so much. And we'll keep an eye out for the follow-up email. Again, just many, many thanks.
Take care, guys. Bye.
Bye, everyone.